He arrived at the music academy early in the morning, wearing the same clothes he had worn the day before. His jacket was old, the stitching loose on one sleeve, and his shoes looked tired from long walks across town. He held a small backpack close to his chest, not because it kept anything valuable, but because it carried the one thing that mattered most to him, a stack of handwritten music sheets he had been collecting for years. He walked toward the large building, feeling slightly out of place among the crowd. Students around him wore polished shoes, expensive watches, and carried shiny instrument cases. Some of them greeted each other with bright confidence, as if they already knew they belonged there. He, on the other hand, kept his eyes low as he stepped through the wide glass doors, grateful that no one stopped him to ask what he was doing. Inside, the lobby was filled with soft chatter. The sound of people warming up their voices, tuning violins, and running fingers over piano keys floated through the hall. It felt like stepping into another world, one he had only watched through screens and imagined during long nights of practice at home. But here he was, in the same place as the people he once admired from afar. As he waited in line to confirm his audition number, he could feel the gaze of others drifting toward him. They looked at his clothes, his backpack, his worn-out shoes, and then looked away as if he didn't belong. Some whispered quietly, just loud enough to be heard, but soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant for him. Did he forget the dress code? One student murmured, "Maybe he's here to watch, not audition." Another said, he pretended not to hear, but the words stuck to him like dust. He had learned long ago that people judged quickly, especially when you didn't fit the picture they expected. Still, he stayed calm and kept his eyes on the front desk as the line slowly moved forward. When his turn came, the woman checking the registrations gave him a quick look. For a moment, he feared she might question him, but she simply found his name on the list and handed him a small card with a number printed on it. He thanked her softly and stepped back into the lobby. He looked down at the number. It felt unreal, proof that he was supposed to be here, even if other people didn't think so. He found a seat in a corner of the waiting area. Students continued to walk past him, some glancing curiously, others ignoring him completely. A group of 3 students sat a few seats away, talking loudly about their private tutors, expensive practice rooms, and how they had spent the past month preparing. He listened quietly, not out of envy, but because he had never met people who lived like that. His own preparation had been different. He practiced late at night in his small living room, sometimes so quietly that even the creaking of the old keyboard sounded like it might wake the neighbors. The keyboard wasn't even a full-size one. Half the keys were cracked or faded, but he knew every inch of it, like it was a part of him. He remembered the nights he stayed up until sunrise, practicing the same passages again and again until they felt like second nature. He remembered the way his fingers would ache, the way his eyes would blur from lack of sleep, and the way he had to stop playing whenever someone knocked on the wall to signal that he was being too loud. But he always returned to the keyboard, no matter how tired he was, because it was the only thing that truly made him feel alive. As he waited for his turn, he looked around at the academy's tall ceilings, bright lights, and wide hallways. Everything was polished, elegant, and expensive. It was the kind of place he used to only see on posters and websites. He felt a deep mixture of excitement and fear. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew he had worked too hard to walk away now. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood for a moment. He remembered the first time he heard a real piano. It was at a community event in his town, where a visiting musician had played a short concert. The sound had amazed him. It felt like the music was telling a story, one he had never heard before, but somehow understood completely. From that day on, he dreamed of learning how to create that same feeling, even if he didn't have the means or the guidance. His family never had much money, but they always tried to support him in small ways. His parent once found an old keyboard at a second-hand shop and brought it home as a surprise. It barely worked, but to him, it was the most precious thing he ever owned. That was where his journey began, in a small living room with peeling paint, chipped keys, and endless hope. A loud voice from the front of the room pulled him out of his thoughts. A staff member announced that the advanced piano auditions would begin soon and asked everyone to gather near the door. Students stood up, adjusting their clothes and stretching their fingers as if preparing for a performance in front of thousands. He stood up too, but stayed at the back of the group. He didn't want any more unwanted attention. As they formed a line outside the audition room, the same group of students who had been whispering earlier turned around and looked at him again. "You're auditioning for the advanced level?" One asked, trying to hide a smirk. He nodded quietly. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" Another added. He simply offered a small smile, neither confirming nor defending himself. He had learned that words meant nothing compared to actions. If he was going to prove himself, it would not be through arguing. It would be through playing. When the door opened, each student went in one by one. Whenever someone came out, some walked with relief, others with frustration. The tension in the hallway grew with every passing minute. He could feel his heartbeat getting faster, but he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He reminded himself why he came, not to impress anyone, not to compare himself, but to share the music he carried inside. As he waited, he couldn't help but feel the difference between him and everyone else. They had taken lessons from professionals. They had access to instruments that cost more than his family could ever dream of owning. They had teachers who corrected their posture, technique, and timing. He had none of that. He learned by watching hundreds of videos online. He watched fingers move across keys, slowing the videos down, repeating them again and again until he could match the movements. He taught himself how to read sheet music by comparing notes to sounds one by one. He trained his ear by listening to recordings late at night, memorizing every detail. Someone in front of him sighed loudly, breaking his thoughts. "I hope the judges are in a good mood today," the student said. Another replied, "They're never in a good mood." He wasn't worried about the judge's mood. He was more worried about controlling his own nerves. He had never played on a grand piano before. The closest he had ever come to one was watching videos or passing by a music store window. The thought scared him, but it also filled him with a strange sense of wonder. He imagined what it would feel like to touch real piano keys that were smooth, responsive, and full of sound. He heard his number called. His heart jumped, and his body felt suddenly light, almost unsteady. He stepped forward slowly as the other students around him stopped talking. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with disbelief, as if they expected him to fail. He didn't look back. He pushed the door open and stepped inside the audition room. The room was quiet, bright, and colder than the hallway. 3 judges sat behind a long table, each with papers and screens in front of them. They glanced at him, their expressions unreadable. A grand piano stood in the center of the room, its polished surface shining under the lights. It was more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. The judge in the middle asked him to state his name and audition piece. He did so quietly but clearly. The judge nodded and told him he could begin whenever he was ready. He walked toward the piano, feeling every step as if the ground beneath him had softened. He sat down carefully, adjusting the bench the way he used to adjust the little stool back home. For a moment, he placed his hands on his lap to steady himself. The piano felt alive. Just resting his fingers on the keys made him feel something he had never felt before, like the instrument was waiting for him, ready to carry his emotions in a way his old keyboard never could. He closed his eyes for a brief second and took a slow breath. All the doubts, the whispers, the worn clothes, the long nights, the heavy walks, the cracked keyboard, Everything that had shaped him gathered in that single moment. He placed his fingers on the keys, and just before he began to play, the room fell into complete silence. Long before he stepped into that bright audition room, his life had been shaped by quiet struggles that most people never saw. Even as he placed his fingers on the keys and prepared to play, parts of his past returned to him like soft echoes, reminding him of the journey that brought him here. He grew up in a small apartment on the edge of his town. The building was old, the paint peeling from the walls, and the windows rattling whenever the wind blew too strongly. Yet to him it was home. He shared the space with his parent, who worked long hours at a local shop. Their life was simple, but filled with a warm kind of hope that made even the hardest days feel bearable. From a young age, he was drawn to music. He didn't have toys like other kids, but he had an old radio that his parent kept in the kitchen. Whenever it played a song with piano in it, he would stop whatever he was doing and listen carefully, as if the sound had cast a spell on him. Sometimes he even sat beside the radio with his eyes closed, imagining that he was the one playing the notes. One evening when he was around 10 years old, he whispered to his parent that he wanted to learn piano. He expected them to laugh or tell him it was impossible. Instead, they smiled gently and said they would try their best to help him, even though both of them knew they couldn't afford lessons or a real instrument. A few months later, after saving small amounts from every paycheck, his parent came home carrying something large, covered with a cloth. He remembered the excitement burning in his chest as he pulled the cloth back and saw an old keyboard. It was second-hand, with scratches and missing paint, and a few keys stuck when pressed. But to him, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He started playing immediately, even though he had no idea what he was doing. He pressed random keys, trying to recreate the sounds he heard on the radio. The more he played, the more he discovered how the keys worked together. Day after day, he sat in the living room experimenting with sounds until he learned simple melodies by ear. His parent often watched him from the kitchen, smiling quietly as he played. They never told him to stop, even when he stayed up late, practicing the same tune again and again. They believed that if something brought their child joy, it deserved space to grow. When he entered his teenage years, the keyboard started failing. The volume would fade without warning. Some keys refused to play, and sometimes it wouldn't turn on at all. But he never complained. Instead, he learned to adapt. He memorized the sounds of the broken keys and imagined them when he practiced. He trained himself to hear music, even when it wasn't actually playing. Around that time, he also discovered free video tutorials online. They became his teachers. Every night, after finishing his homework, he sat in front of the old laptop his neighbor had given him and watched videos of pianists explaining techniques. He would pause the video every few seconds, mimic the movements, and then replay it again to check if he was doing it right. He had no one to correct him, no one to tell him if his posture was wrong or if his fingers were too stiff. So he taught himself through comparison. He watched professional pianists and paid attention to the smallest details, their hand motions, their timing, the way their bodies moved with the music. Sometimes he watched the same tutorial 10 or 20 times until he could follow it with ease. Those nights were long, but they were filled with quiet determination. He practiced until his fingers were tired, until the small room felt warm from the effort he put into it. Sometimes he forgot to eat, and other times he didn't realize it was already past midnight until his parent gently told him to rest. But sleep always felt far away when his heart was full of music. His school life was different from his home life. Most of the students there didn't understand why he loved piano so much. Some teased him for carrying around a notebook filled with musical notes. Others made jokes about his old keyboard. But he never let their words get to him. He believed that passion didn't need approval. One thing that motivated him the most was a memory from when he was 12. The town had hosted a small event, inviting a well-known performer to play for the community. He remembered standing in a crowd, staring up at the stage, mesmerized by the grand piano that gleamed under the lights. It was the first time he had seen a real piano up close. When the performer started playing, the music flowed like water smooth, emotional, powerful. That night changed him. He went home and told himself that one day he would play on a real piano too, not just a broken keyboard in a dim living room. He didn't know when or how, but he believed it with all his heart. As time passed, his skills improved in ways even he didn't fully understand. He developed a strong ear for music, able to catch mistakes instantly. He learned how to play difficult pieces by listening to them repeatedly instead of relying on sheet music. His sense of rhythm became natural, almost instinctive, like breathing. One day, while scrolling through music forums, he found a post about an open audition at a prestigious academy. They were offering a limited number of scholarships for talented students who lacked financial support. The moment he read about it, something inside him stirred. It felt like everything he had been practicing for suddenly had a purpose. He showed the post to his parent, expecting them to hesitate. Instead, they encouraged him wholeheartedly. They didn't have money for travel or preparation, but they promised they would manage. And just like that, his dream found a doorway. The next few weeks were intense. He spent hours outdoors, walking to the instrument repair shop where he worked part-time. The owner allowed him to use the shop's old piano during lunch breaks. Though the piano was scratched and slightly out of tune, it was still a real piano, 1,000 times better than his broken keyboard at home. Every moment he spent there felt like magic. The weight of the keys under his fingers, the rich sound filling the small room, the way each note vibrated, it all felt like discovering a world he had only imagined. The shop owner often watched him play, and sometimes shook his head in disbelief, whispering, "You've got something special, kid." With every passing day, he practiced harder. He studied sheets he found online and recorded himself playing so he could hear his mistakes. He corrected his timing, improved his dynamics, and learned how to express emotion through sound. He pushed himself to the edge of exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He knew the audition was not just about talent. It was about proving that his years of struggle meant something. On the night before the audition, he barely slept. He packed his backpack with his music sheets and a small snack his parent made for him. They hugged him before he left home in the early morning, whispering that no matter what happened, they were already proud of him. When he finally reached the academy that morning and stepped into the grand building, he felt both small and hopeful. The polished floors, the echo of instruments warming up, the confident voices around him, everything felt distant from the life he knew. But he didn't let the differences overwhelm him. Instead, he held on to the belief that music belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford it. While waiting for his turn, he couldn't help but observe the other students. They talked about their teachers, expensive summer programs, and competitions they had won. He listened quietly, not with jealousy, but with a sense of curiosity. It amazed him how different their lives were from his. Yet, in that moment, all of them were gathered for the same purpose. To play. As he stood in line outside the audition room, he felt the sting of judgment from others who looked at his clothes and made assumptions. But he refused to let their opinions shake him. He had learned long ago that people often judged what they didn't understand, and he wasn't there to impress them. He was there because he had earned the right to be. When his number was finally called, he felt a deep mix of fear and excitement. He walked into the room with quiet steps, knowing that everything he had worked for was about to be tested. The judge's skeptical eyes didn't surprise him. He had seen that look many times from people who doubted him before he played. But standing in front of the grand piano, He felt something shift. It wasn't confidence exactly, more like a sense of belonging he hadn't expected to feel. The piano wasn't judging him. It wasn't comparing him to anyone else. It was simply waiting, and as he prepared to play his first note, he remembered every long night, every broken key, every moment of doubt, every whispered encouragement from his parent, every step of his journey. For the first time in his life, he wasn't playing for himself. He was playing for the dream that kept him alive. When he placed his fingers on the piano keys, the room felt strangely quiet, as if even the air around him was waiting to see what he would do. His heart was beating fast, but he tried not to let the judges notice. He had never played on such a beautiful instrument before. The keys felt cool under his fingers, smoother than anything he had ever touched. For a moment, he forgot he was being judged at all. It was just him and the piano, like all the nights he had spent practicing alone at home. He took one slow breath, the kind that steadied him when nerves threatened to take over. He could feel the weight of everything he had been through sitting on his shoulders. But instead of letting it make him anxious, he used it as fuel. He reminded himself that this moment was not an accident. He had earned his place here, even if no one else in the room knew how hard he had worked to reach this point. The first note he played was soft, almost like a whisper, but it carried across the room with surprising clarity. He felt the sound vibrate through the piano, then through his hands, then through his chest. It was a feeling he had only imagined until now. As he moved to the next note, and then the next, something inside him began to relax. It was as if the music had taken over the part of him that was scared. The piece he chose to play was difficult, something that required focus and control from beginning to end. He had spent months practicing it, listening to every recording he could find, studying every tiny detail. The piece had become a part of him, almost like a second language he spoke through his hands. Now, as he played it on a real piano for the first time, he felt the notes come alive in a way he had never experienced before. At first, the judges watched him with the same doubtful expression they had when he walked in. They sat with their pens ready, their eyes half focused, as if expecting to hear the mistakes he was certain they thought he would make. But as the music continued, their expressions slowly changed. Their eyebrows rose. Their pens stopped moving. One judge leaned forward slightly, as if trying to understand what he was hearing. He didn't look at them, but he could sense the shift. He kept his eyes on the keys. His fingers moved quickly in some parts, slowly in others. He poured everything into the music, every struggle, every quiet fear, every moment he had wished for a chance like this. He didn't just play the notes. He felt them, and that feeling spread through the room in a way that surprised even him. There was a part in the middle of the piece where the melody softened. It became gentle, almost fragile, like a voice speaking quietly in the dark. As he played that section, he thought of the night he almost gave up. He had been practicing in his living room, the old keyboard flickering on and off, refusing to work properly. He remembered feeling so frustrated he wanted to throw it away. But instead, he took a deep breath and tried again. That moment, though small, had shaped him. It taught him that passion was not just about talent, it was about persistence. He brought that feeling into the soft melody, letting every note speak in a way words never could. When he reached the stronger part of the piece, his fingers moved with a confidence he rarely felt in real life. The sound filled the room completely. It was bold and full of emotion. He wasn't thinking anymore. He wasn't worried. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply letting the music show who he was. Outside the audition room, the hallway had gone unusually quiet. The students waiting for their turn could hear faint echoes of the performance coming from behind the door. Those who had earlier laughed or whispered about him now leaned closer, trying to understand how someone who looked so out of place could play with such control and passion. Inside the room, the judges exchanged glances. They were not expecting this. They were not expecting someone with worn-out clothes and anxious eyes to be playing at a level far beyond many trained students. One judge lowered their pen completely. Another rested their hand under their chin, watching him with full attention. Still, he didn't look up. He focused on the final part of the piece, the most challenging part. It required speed, precision, and emotion all at once. On his old keyboard, the keys used to stick during this part, making it nearly impossible to practice smoothly. But he practiced anyway. He memorized the movements, even when the keyboard couldn't keep up. His hands had been shaped by those long nights, by practice done without proper tools, without guidance, without anyone telling him he was doing it right. Now, for the first time, he was playing that section on an instrument that responded perfectly to every touch. And it felt like his hands had been waiting for this moment all their life. As he reached the last few measures, his heartbeat quickened. He wanted to end strong. He wanted to leave something in the room, not pride, not arrogance, but truth. His truth. The final notes rang through the air, clear and powerful. They lingered for a second before fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Even he kept his hands resting gently on the keys, not ready to return to reality just yet. When he finally lifted his hands, the silence continued. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of doubt. It was the kind of silence that follows something meaningful, the kind people keep when they don't want to break the moment too soon. He looked up slowly, unsure of what he would see. The judges' faces were different now. The skepticism was gone. In its place was a mix of surprise and something else, respect. One judge looked almost emotional, though they tried to hide it behind their professional expression. "Where did you learn to play like this?" The judge in the middle asked softly, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the mood. He hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to sound dramatic or make excuses. So he simply spoke the truth. "I learned at home," he said quietly, "on an old keyboard. I watched free videos online and practiced every day." The judges blinked, surprised by the simplicity of his answer. "You didn't take any formal lessons?" Another judge asked. He shook his head. "And this is your first time playing on a grand piano?" He nodded. The judges exchanged another look. One of them scribbled something onto their paper, but the expression on their face was no longer one of judgment. It was one of disbelief, the kind that appears when someone encounters something extraordinary. "Would you mind playing another piece?" The judge in the middle asked. The request caught him off guard. Usually, auditions followed a strict structure. Students played one piece, the judges evaluated, and that was it. Asking for a second performance meant something significant. He swallowed nervously, but nodded. "Anything you like," the judge added. "Something that shows your style." He thought for a moment. Then he chose something personal, a short piece he had composed himself. He never shared it with anyone before. He played it during nights when his heart felt heavy or uncertain. The melody had become like a quiet friend he returned to whenever he needed clarity. He placed his fingers on the keys again and began to play. This piece was different from the one he had played earlier. It wasn't technically complicated, but it was emotional. It held pieces of his journey, the loneliness, the small victories, the hope that kept him moving forward when everything felt overwhelming. The notes were soft at first, carrying a gentle sadness, then slowly grew warmer. Like a light appearing in a dark room. As he played, memories of his parent came to him, the long days they worked, the tired smiles, the way they always encouraged him, even when they were struggling themselves. He thought of the nights he practiced quietly so he wouldn't disturb anyone. He thought of the times he doubted himself and how he kept going only because music made him feel alive. He poured all of that into the melody dot. By the time he reached the final note, he felt a sting behind his eyes. But he kept himself composed. He lifted his hands slowly and rested them on his lap. When he looked up, the judges were silent again. Not the cold silence of before, but something softer, more meaningful. One judge cleared their throat, almost awkwardly, as if trying to find the right words, but failing. "Thank you," the judge finally said. "That was beautiful." He lowered his head slightly in appreciation. He didn't know what else to say. He didn't expect praise. He wasn't used to people noticing his music. But hearing that single word, beautiful, felt like a small piece of validation he didn't realize he needed. "You may wait outside," another judge said gently. "We will discuss and call you shortly." He stood up carefully, not wanting to disturb the emotional stillness in the room. As he walked toward the door, he paused for a moment, taking one last look at the piano. He felt grateful, as if the instrument had become a companion, guiding him instead of judging him. He stepped outside into the hallway and quietly closed the door behind him. The students waiting there stared at him with wide eyes. Some looked confused, others surprised. A few who had laughed earlier were now silent, unsure of what to say, but he didn't pay attention to any of them. He simply walked to an empty chair, sat down, and placed his hands on his knees. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to smile, small, quiet, and full of relief. He had done everything he could. Now, all he could do was wait. The night before the big event, he barely slept. He lay on the small couch in his tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about every little detail. He thought about the lights, the faces in the crowd, the pressure, the mistakes he might make. Then he took a deep breath and reminded himself why he had come so far. He wasn't trying to impress the rich or prove anything to the people who had mocked him. He just wanted to play. That was the truth deep inside him. He simply wanted the world to hear what he had carried in his heart for years. He woke up early the next morning, even though he had hardly closed his eyes. The sunlight was soft, slipping through the thin curtains. He sat up slowly, letting the quiet of the morning calm him. Then he went to the worn-out piano in the corner and lifted the lid. He pressed one key, then another, letting the soft notes warm up his hands and his confidence. He didn't play much, just enough to feel steady again. He packed lightly before leaving. He put on the same clothes he had worn the previous day, the same clothes that had made people judge him. They were clean, but simple. A plain shirt, dark pants, and an old coat whose stitching was coming loose near the edges. He looked at himself in the mirror and felt a little embarrassed, but he reminded himself that clothes had never given him skill. They had never given him passion, and they were not going to take anything away from him now. The city was already buzzing by the time he reached the streets. Cars passed, horns echoed, and people rushed in every direction. He walked quietly through all of it, keeping his hands tucked in his pockets to shield them from the cold air. While he walked, he repeated the melody in his mind. Every sound, every turn, every rise and fall of the music played inside him like a living thing. When he arrived at the event building, the staff at the front door looked unsure again. They clearly didn't expect someone like him to be part of such a prestigious event. One of them even whispered something to another, and they both glanced at him. But this time, he didn't let the comments sink into his heart. He just showed his pass and walked inside with calm steps. The hall was even more beautiful than the first time he had seen it. The chandeliers sparkled above him, and the entire room smelled faintly of flowers. Staff members rushed around carrying papers, instruments, and cables. Performers rehearsed their steps or practiced lines in corners. Everyone seemed to fit perfectly into the scene, everyone except him. But he reminded himself, again, He didn't come for the decor or the cameras. He came for the piano. A coordinator approached him with a clipboard. She looked at him for a moment, as if trying to match his face to the list she held. "You're performing third," she said after finding his name on the sheet. "Please be ready backstage. The audience will be seated soon." He nodded respectfully, thanked her, and followed her directions. He found a quiet spot backstage where he could hear the muffled sounds of people gathering in the hall. He listened to their footsteps, their soft laughter, the distant clinking of glasses. He knew that many of them were people who had never imagined someone like him would share the same grand space. But he didn't feel fear anymore. He felt a steady resolve. A young man carrying a violin walked past him and paused. "Are you performing too?" he asked kindly. He nodded. "That's great," the violinist said with a friendly smile. "Good luck out there." It was a small gesture, but it meant more than the violinist knew. It reminded him that not everyone judged. Some people just saw others for who they were, or who they were trying to be. The event began soon after. The host's voice filled the hall as he introduced the first performer. The applause was loud and cheerful. Backstage, he listened, breathing slowly and evenly. His hands remained still in his lap. He wasn't shaking now. Instead, he felt a calm focus, as if everything he had been through, all the comments, all the stares, all the doubts, had shaped him into someone stronger. When the first performer finished, the second act started a singer accompanied by a small band. Their performance was energetic, and the crowd responded with excitement. He could hear the cheers even from backstage. He smiled a little, not out of envy, but because he understood what it meant to touch a room full of people with your heart. Then he heard his name. It was his turn. The sound of his name echoed in his ears as he stood up. His legs were steady. His heart did beat fast, but it was the good kind of fast, the kind that shows something big is about to happen. He stepped onto the stage slowly. The bright lights fell on him, and for a moment he couldn't see the crowd clearly. All he saw was a blur of shapes and shadows. But he could feel them, their silence, their curiosity, their surprise at seeing him again, wearing the same clothes they had judged. He didn't look away. He walked calmly to the piano in the center of the stage. The grand piano gleamed under the lights, its surface almost like a mirror. He placed his fingers on the keys. They felt cool beneath his skin. For a brief moment, everything went still. The entire hall fell silent. No one moved. No one whispered. It was as if everyone realized that something unexpected was about to happen. And then he began to play dot at first. The melody was gentle, like a soft stream flowing through quiet woods. His fingers moved with careful precision, each note placed with intention. The crowd leaned forward without even realizing it. Then the music grew stronger. He shifted into the heart of the piece he had practiced for months. His fingers flew across the keys, rising and falling in waves of sound. The music filled every corner of the hall, rising above the chandeliers, sweeping across the rows of seats, touching every listener one by one. People stared with wide eyes. Some exchanged looks of disbelief. Others simply sat frozen, unable to look away. He didn't see any of that. His eyes were half closed, focused entirely on the emotion in the music. He wasn't just playing notes, he was telling a story. A story of struggle and hope, of being judged and rising above it. A story of not giving up even when the world thought you didn't belong. The music climbed to its final peak, then slowly drifted down like a fading sunset, leaving the room in a gentle quiet that felt almost sacred. The last note hung in the air, trembling softly. Before finally settling, he lifted his hands from the keys, and the room erupted. People stood up. They clapped, cheered, and shouted. The applause was louder than anything he had heard in his life. Some viewers wiped tears from their eyes. Others looked embarrassed, as if realizing how wrong their first judgment had been. He stood there, stunned, feeling as if the world had opened a door he had been knocking on for years. But inside, he was calm. He didn't need their praise to feel proud. He already knew who he was. He stood on the stage, still trying to understand everything that was happening. The applause washed over him like a warm wave. It felt unreal, almost like he had stepped into someone else's dream. For a long moment, he didn't move. He simply stood beside the piano, breathing slowly, taking in the sight of people standing for him, people who had looked at him earlier with doubt, even annoyance. Now they looked different. Their faces showed surprise, respect, and something else he had not expected. Admiration. The host stepped back onto the stage, smiling so widely it almost seemed forced, as if trying to act like he had known all along that this performer would amaze the crowd. But the young man didn't let that distract him. He simply bowed politely. He didn't know how else to respond to such a powerful moment. After the applause finally softened, he walked off the stage. The hallway behind the curtains felt strangely quiet compared to the noise of the hall. For a second, he leaned against the wall, letting out a long breath. He didn't feel tired. Instead, he felt light, as if something heavy he had carried for years had finally fallen away. The coordinator rushed toward him. Her eyes were wide with excitement. "That was incredible," she said, almost out of breath. "People are talking about you everywhere. I've never seen a reaction like that here." He smiled shyly. "Thank you," he said softly. She shook her head in disbelief. "I'm sorry if anyone treated you poorly earlier. I think they just didn't realize." Her voice trailed off, and she didn't need to finish. He understood. "It's all right," he said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes people don't know what they're looking at." She nodded slowly, as if learning something new right in that moment. As he continued down the hallway, other performers approached him too. Some patted him on the shoulder. Others said kind words or congratulated him. A few looked embarrassed, unable to make eye contact. Maybe they had judged him earlier. Maybe they had dismissed him without bothering to know who he was. He didn't hold it against them. Tonight had taught him something important. Not everyone who looks at you sees you clearly. But sometimes all it takes is one moment for everything to change. A staff member guided him to a small waiting area where he could rest while the next performances continued. He sat down slowly, letting his hands relax in his lap. They still tingled from the energy of the performance. He looked down at the old coat he was wearing and felt a sudden mix of emotions. People had laughed at it. They had treated him like he didn't belong. But tonight, this coat had stood on that stage with him. It had been part of his journey, and he felt a strange attachment to it now, like it held memories no fancy suit could ever have. After a little while, someone from the event team entered the room. He was an older man with glasses and a calm expression. He carried a small notebook in his hand, and his steps were measured and slow. He stopped in front of the young man and offered a warm handshake. "I watched your performance," the man said. His voice was gentle but confident. "It was extraordinary. You have something rare." The young man thanked him quietly. The older man continued, "I work with several music programs in the city. We help young performers grow, find opportunities, build careers. I would like to talk to you about joining us, if you are interested." The young man stared at him for a moment, unsure if he had heard correctly. He had dreamed of something like this, but never believed it would come from such an event. He nodded slowly, unable to find the right words. "We don't need to decide anything right now," the older man said kindly. "I'll leave you my card. When you're ready, we can talk." He placed the card in the young man's hand and walked away. The young man looked down at the card. It felt heavier than it looked, as if it carried possibilities he had never imagined. But something inside him remained steady. He didn't want to rush. He didn't want to say yes, simply because it sounded like a dream. He wanted to understand what was right for him. And he needed time for that. Later, when the event ended, the hallways grew busy again as people prepared to leave. He walked out through the side entrance to avoid the crowd. The night air was cool and fresh. The city lights sparkled in the distance, stretching across the skyline like a blanket of stars. A few people noticed him near the exit. They recognized him from the stage and hurried over. They thanked him, praised him, told him how deeply his music had touched them. One woman even said she had cried because the melody reminded her of her childhood. Others apologized for doubting him earlier. He listened to all of them with patience, offering kind words and smiles. Then one young man stepped forward. He looked nervous, almost guilty. "I was one of the people who made fun of your clothes," he admitted quietly. "And I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I didn't know what you could do." The pianist looked at him gently. "It's all right," he said. "Sometimes people judge before they understand. But thank you for saying this." The young man nodded and walked away with relief written all over his face. After everyone left, the street grew quieter. The pianist stood there alone for a moment, looking at the building where everything had changed. He didn't feel anger toward those who had mistreated him. He didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. What he felt instead was gratitude. Gratitude that he had stayed true to himself. Gratitude that he had taken the chance, even when it seemed pointless. And gratitude that music had given him a voice in a room full of people who probably would have ignored him. Otherwise, he began walking home slowly. The city felt different now, not because the streets had changed, but because his heart had. The cold air touched his face gently, and he breathed deeply as he walked past shops, cafes, and quiet corners. Everything looked familiar, yet new at the same time. When he reached his apartment, he placed the card from the older man on the small table beside his piano. He sat down in front of the piano and touched the keys lightly. They felt warm now, like they held the memory of the night inside them. He didn't play anything dramatic. He didn't try to prove anything to himself or anyone else. Instead, he played a simple tune, a soft, calming melody that floated through the room like a whisper. This was his way of ending the day. Quiet, honest, and peaceful. As the music filled the room, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel proud, not because people clapped for him, but because he had finally learned something important. The world may judge quickly, but it also listens. And when it listens, it sometimes discovers the truth it never expected. He smiled slightly as he finished the last line of the melody. Tomorrow would come with new questions, doors opening, choices to make, dreams to shape. But tonight, he was simply himself. A young man with an old coat, a tired piano, and a heart full of music. And that was enough.